Welcome to Unit 1, Topic 3 from the CHET Project, the Creativity Techniques for Higher Education Teachers. This topic is about how to motivate engineering students, and my name is Max, and I will guide you through this presentation. In this unit, you will learn about what motivation is in general, the different forms of motivation that concern the basic understanding of motivation, and if there are idiosyncrasies for engineering students regarding their motivation. And last but not least, you will get hands-on practical advice on how to unblock motivation in your teaching setup. And motivation, the enabler, as the picture quite nicely shows, it can move you from an attitude saying, I can't do it, to I can do it. And hopefully it will kind of trigger you a little bit to follow the presentation and try to get the most out of it for your teaching. So, what is motivation? We wanted to start with Ryan and Dickey's quote here. Motivation concerns energy, direction, persistence, and equifinality, all aspects of activation and intention. And that means motivation produces. Motivation is the driving force to individuals executing a task, doing something, producing. And for now, it's only relevant to acknowledge that motivation is the force behind people doing something. We will look into the reason why they do it later on, but just acknowledging it also shows the high relevance for managers, for leaders, and obviously also for teachers, as you would like your students to do something. And if you understand the concept of motivation, it's of course useful. And we distinguish between two potential paths of motivation. On the one hand, we have extrinsic motivation, so a desire to do something as a means to attain something, for example, a reward. On the other hand, we have intrinsic motivation, a genuine desire coming from within. And as an example for an extrinsic motivation, you could look at an employee who chases a bonus or some other form of appraisal at the job, or a student that expects a good first job after attaining a certain degree. For an intrinsically motivated student, you would assume that he pursues the inner satisfaction of doing or achieving a goal. To them, for example, it could be rewarding that they learn new stuff and develop their skills and competences. So, now it's time for you to reflect on your motivation when you were a student. Um, Please take 3 minutes and think about, were you motivated intrinsically or extrinsically? Were you motivated in all courses and phases of your study? And what motivated you? I'll tell you when the 3 minutes are up. All right, the 3 minutes are up. And the purpose of this exercise was actually to get you to reflect on your own motivation, as this can give you important insights on your students' motivation. However, stay aware that every student is motivated differently. And in order to evaluate whether intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation can achieve better results, we have this quote from Ryan and Decky here again, where they state, intrinsically motivated people have more interest, excitement, and confidence, which in turn is manifested both as enhanced performance, persistence, and creativity, and as heightened vitality and self-esteem and general well-being. This is so even when the people have the same level of perceived competence or self-efficacy for the activity. This really shows that intrinsically motivated students or people in general can achieve better results than extrinsically motivated people. So we want to stimulate our students' intrinsic motivation. That will help them learn and develop. And although it is not necessarily an easy task to stimulate the intrinsic motivation, you, as the teacher, must consider making room for their independent and self-developmental learning. So, what you as a teacher could seek to stimulate is a student that is active, inquisitive, curious, and playful, and even in the absence of specific reward. And asking that, who do you think combines all of those attitudes? That perfectly describes a little baby. And we were all like this. The level of exploration, curiosity, and eagerness to learn without even knowing what the term learning means is something extremely useful and something that is worth trying to seek in different forms now. And talking about motivation, we have to talk about the self-determination theory. Self-determination theory posits the importance of social contextual factors in human motivation. It was invented by Ryan Dickey and basically says there are three core needs of individuals that explain motivation to do a certain task. And those three needs are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And competence means the need of mastery. So, for example, an apprentice trying to learn something from his supervisor, for example, to not ask him the next time again how to do a certain task, but developing the skill on his own. The second one, the relatedness, means the need of belonging to a group. We see that individuals prefer to be in a group to exchange with peers and have contact to people with overlapping interests. And as a third point, the autonomy describes the need of experiencing control, which on the one hand means that you are able to make decisions on your own, and on the other, that the decisions actually have an impact. So it's not only theoretical what you decide or what you think of, but making and doing a task has really an impact. And now we would like you to take 3 minutes again and reflect on the components of the self-determination theory in relation to your students. Think about how do they experience competence, relatedness, and autonomy in your teaching setup. I'll let you know when the 3 minutes are up. So the time is up. Thank you for participating in the task, and it's nice to know that the three components are always good to think about when planning, executing, and evaluating your teaching. And now we move forward in the topic and have a look at creativity, performance, and motivation, the impact of motivation to the creative performance. And Amabile put it, if motivation is missing, the expected creative output automatically decreases. So here we show you the high relevance of the upcoming slides to the creative output that your students can produce. And the creative performance depends on three components based on Amabile. The first one is the domain relevant skills, then we have creativity relevant skills, and the task motivation. We're going to talk about task motivation now, but I'll give you a brief explanation of the first two. The domain relevant skills describe technical skills that you learned through formal or informal education that you can make use of in a certain area, while creativity relevant skills are those that you actually learned in the previous chat topic, and they also depend on educational background that you have heard of creativity skills, and you're able to generate novel ideas, to come up with novel ideas and have an idea of the concept of creativity. Third one is the task motivation. And for task motivation, we have this beautiful quote from Amabile saying that task motivation makes the difference between what an engineer can do and what he will do. And what he can do is his ability, and that is determined by the domain relevant skills and the creativity relevant skills that we had on the previous slide. But what he will do, determining his willingness to which he will fully engage his expertise and creative thinking skills in the service of creative performance. That's what finally determines the successful outcome of a creative performance. And now let's look at engineering students. Do we see differences regarding their motivation compared to other students, for example? A study from Kazakin and Kreitler tried to find differences between engineering students and architectural students' motivation for creativity. And they found differences between the two study programs, and the engineering students scored higher in three categories. First one being freedom in functioning. Engineering students were a lot more focused and put a greater emphasis on acting according to their own rules um, rather than rules set by others. They were more receptive to and absorbing from the environment, meaning taking their environment into consideration and also getting inspiration for motivation, for creativity from the environment. And they were more demanding from oneself, so showing greater effort and perseverance compared to architectural students. And now I would like you to compare these three important factors with the factors of the self-determination theory that we talked about earlier. Are they comparable in any way? And remember that competence, relatedness, and autonomy are the factors that are important for being motivated in general, whereas freedom in functioning, being receptive to and absorbing from the environment, as well as demanding something from oneself, relates specifically to engineering students' motivation for being creative. I'll let you know when the 3 minutes are up. All right, the time is up. And just to wrap up this task, we hope that you could get something out of it by comparing the components of the self-determination theory and what we just heard previously about the engineering students' motivation for creativity. And you could, for example, assume that the need for competence relates to demanding from oneself. The relatedness could be that the students are absorbing from the environment and also the need for belonging to a group, while autonomy really sounds like the freedom of functioning. And now we want to introduce you to the more practical advice, get more practical and less theoretical about motivation. And so we just summarized here the maxims of creativity in engineering education and put it into those three brackets, um, talking about first the students and the teachers. What do they have to do? They have to keep an open mind and search for multiple answers. This is something that students and teachers can do um, both together. While the students, on their side, they have to need to learn to fail in order to be creative, to come up with creative outcomes. And also, they have to experience the ownership of learning. While as teachers have to show that ambiguity is good, they should use iterative processes so to allow for experimentation and should lead by example. And with those very broad and almost generic advice, we will go into more detail in the hands-on section now on how to unblock motivation. In a study from Leo and Schönwetter, they suggest that there are 10 blocks to creativity that you can address in order to overcome the block and induce creative performance. And we will concentrate on three of those that we find especially important when talking about engineering students. And those three are the fear of failure, the frustration avoidance, and the reluctance to play. And we will look at those now in more depth. The first block to creativity that we're going to talk in depth about is the fear of failure. And most likely you had contact with a person that feared failure and therefore settled for less. So the description is drawing back, not taking risks, and settling for less in order to avoid possible pain or shame of failing. And it doesn't matter if it's in an assignment where you ask for some creative input, or if it's an in-class activity, students fear failing and therefore will not give the full 100% when it comes to creativity. And what can you do to overcome that? And a solution to overcome that is basically to show students that failure is not bad, but it's an opportunity to learn something. And this may sound very general, but is rooted deeply in the difference actually between a creativity outcome and business as usual. Um, so we want to take one step back here to really analyze why is failure so important, or why is it important to show that failure is not bad and rather a learning opportunity. And that understanding can derive from looking at creativity as a precursor of innovation. So you need creative input to come up with something innovative, with something novel. And something novel cannot derive from something out of old habits and old routines. So innovation is not business as usual. We need to take a new approach to coming up with something innovative rather than going the old path of business as usual. And in order to really highlight that, you see a little table here on listing the differences between execution and innovation. So the business as usual execution of tasks versus trying to come up with something novel. So the main distinguishing factors between execution as being the business as usual versus the innovation activity is in innovative seeking activities, you have a low predictability of the outcome, whereas in executive activities, you know what the outcome should look like. If someone has a certain task, he knows what to do, and the outcome is predictable for the manager or supervisor. Um, so failing to execute a task is, in a business as usual case, not an option, as failure means someone did not execute the task according to plan and you don't have the outcome that you expected. Whereas in innovative tasks, failure is part of an iterative learning process. So you don't have the high cost of failure, meaning the production supply or something is lacking behind, but you learn something from the experience. You learn what does not work and how to achieve a better result in the next try. And the next block to creativity is the frustration avoidance. We all might have experienced some frustration and gave up too soon when faced with obstacles. And this also goes for the students. Um, in order to avoid the pain or discomfort associated with change or novel solutions, and also it's sometimes exhausting to have a task at hand that you can't solve. And at one point, you get too exhausted and you give up. As a solution, you can tell stories about inventors who stayed persistent, because persistence is actually a necessary factor to be creative, to come up with something innovative. And as an example, you can take Thomas Alva Edison, who conducted numerous experiments, and we quoted him here. I never quit until I get what I'm after. Negative results are just what I'm after. They are just as valuable to me as positive results. So it's the persistence, and also draws back to the fear of failure, actually, where you take failure as a learning experience to get better for the next experiment. The next block to creativity is the reluctance to play. You might have experienced this as well in the in-class activities, actually, where students were not playing around with material because they feared to look foolish or to do something silly in that in-class activity. And there is actually a way to overcome that block to creativity, namely by providing hands-on learning experience, making theories tangible, show own willingness to play, meaning first of all, you should be a role model and you should lead by example. So don't fear to look silly in front of your students, so they can take you as an example and do the same in the activity. And also show how the theory connects to the practical activity that you suggest them to do. This could be done, for example, by using a sandpit approach, giving the students access to a broad spectrum of materials for the activity and in order to achieve a creative outcome. Now we want to talk about how the physical environment comes into play when inducing creative performance of students. Because we know that VARK matters. It stands for visual, auditory, read and write, and kinesthetic preferences. And we know that students have individual preferences when it comes to approaching creative tasks, and that influences their creative performance. So we should generally be aware of the four different learning styles and try to offer a variety of formats so that every student has his preference addressed. For example, the learning style visual concerns students who value visual aspects more than the average student. They respond to images and graphics, and on the one hand, that means you can work with visuals and you can also let them work visually. So let them make sketches, graphs, flowcharts, etc. The auditory learning style, in contrast to the visual, prefers to hear oral presentations. And in order to satisfy the need of auditory learning style students, you can on the one hand give them rich oral descriptions and also let them talk for themselves in groups, ideation phases, etc. The read and write learning style concerns students who prefer words and who prefer to read and write, as the name says. And and in order to adequately address this group of learning style students, you can provide text-based input and ask for written output. And lastly, the kinesthetic learning style means that students prefer a physical hands-on approach, as kinesthetic means um, grasping something by the physical experiencing. And in order to address this group, you can, for example, bring products to class. You can let them work with prototypes or mock-ups in order to really let them physically work and experience in class. And now we have our last time to reflect exercise for you. Take 3 minutes and ask yourself, what do you do to accommodate the different learning styles? Do you focus on all four of them? And what could you do to address those that you're probably lacking, might be lacking? 3 minutes, I'll tell you when the time is up again. All right, time's up. I hope you could take something out of this task. And now we will have a look how you can find out, or how your students can find out, what learning style they prefer. If you go, or your students go to vark-learn.com, they can test themselves and become aware of their learning style and preference. Congratulations, you reached the end of this presentation, and that gives me the opportunity to wrap up what we learned in this unit. So at first we spoke about what is motivation in general. You know, it concerns the activation and intention of an individual to execute a task, to learn something, to do something. And there are different forms of motivation. First, we spoke about the extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So extrinsic meaning you have external rewards for doing something, for executing a task. And intrinsic motivation means you're doing something out of a genuine desire coming from within. So we know that intrinsic motivation actually achieves more successful results and a higher likelihood of achieving a successful result compared to extrinsically motivated students. And then we talked about the self-determination theory, which gives a social contextual factor to motivation. And the self-determination theory says that we human beings, we are motivated to do something because we have three core needs that we have to satisfy. It's the need of competence, need of relatedness, and need of autonomy. And those three explain a lot of the tasks that we do and why we make an effort to do something. And then we had a look at engineering students' motivation. Is there a difference between an engineering student and students from other fields? And we found some differences actually, and see that engineering students scored higher in three categories compared to other students, namely the categories of freedom and functioning, being receptive and to the environment, and demanding from oneself. So we know that engineering students are absorbing the environment and learning from it. They are demanding, so demanding from themselves, meaning they are persistent. They are really making an effort to learn something or to execute a task. So we know they have what it takes to also be creative, to be motivated to be creative. And that's what we looked at in the last section, where we wanted to see the blocks to motivation and give practical advice how to unblock it, how to induce creative performance from engineering students. And there we actually saw that a playful and open teaching experience and creativity activity will induce creative performance and a creative outcome from class activities. And also the physical environment comes into play when you really try to shape the class activity towards different learning styles of students. So at least you know that there are different learning styles, namely the visual, auditory, the read and write, and the kinesthetic learning style. Also try to take that into consideration. For further references, if you're interested in reading a bit more, we listed the sources of this presentation here on this list. Feel free to read more on your own. And thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you learned something, and hopefully you can take some of the learnings with you in your class activities. Best of luck. Bye bye.